Hello and welcome to Unacademy. I welcome you all to this very interesting session lined up for you, which is a world history specific marathon. So we'll wait 2 3 minutes for everybody to come through. Good evening to all of you. And the agenda for today is very simple but very critical, both for a beginner and also for somebody who's going to write the examination this year, which is we'll discuss a word which is mentioned in the syllabus, which is revolutions. And that means American, French, and Industrial Revolution. Brace yourself for at least 3 hours. We will go on till 11:30 for sure. And I hope that all of you are excited and ready for something like that. And what we will do is we will go from the basics to the advanced level. We'll discuss what are the chain of events, we'll discuss the causes and everything related to that. So I hope you have shared this session with your friends and you have subscribed to our channel and everything else is sorted. Do remember that the 50% plus 6 months free extension offer for 22,999 is back, and you should use this to become a part of our program itself. And you already know that Platinum, along with Plus, Iconic, multiple different options are available to you. And for anything related to history, or if you don't want to miss out on any of these sessions, just subscribe to this Telegram channel and you will be able to get all the updates. And the idea is very simple: world history as part of your syllabus is mains specific. But what is very interesting about world history is that without an understanding of world history, you cannot understand IR properly. You will not understand modern India properly in that regard. Further, a lot of different essays, even the terminologies which you see in current affairs, you will not be able to understand it. For example, if you don't know what is the Iron Curtain, the Iron Curtain 2.0 will not make sense only, what it actually means. And therefore, we have to understand what is the relationship of world history with other subjects. And other than that, we have to now discuss the revolutions, a word which is mentioned directly in the syllabus GS paper 1. And do understand one thing very clearly, that the questions may be up and down, but because there is intersectionality with IR, it also becomes relevant for GS paper 2. So the ROI here, the return on investment is good enough to at least go through a session like this. Which is, if you can go through a session like this with me, you within the next 3 to 3.5 hours will finish all of these concepts and you will be sorted as it is. You would need it if you're writing the examination, or if you will then prepare for world history in a program, or because the problem with world history is also there's no real book list. People tend to talk about Arjan Dev. People tend to say that you should read Norman Law, but the problem with Norman Law is it only starts from 1914. And Arjan Dev is not written from a perspective of UPSC. Over and above that, if you go with the ninth or 11th class NCRT, that again has a lot of details which are irrelevant for the examination. Meaning, what happens is if you try to use these sources, you will get a lot of information, but you will never be able to write a good answer. And that is when there needs to be a clarity of thought, a clarity of understanding, which we will try to inculcate in the next 3.5 hours. So if everybody's here, can we start? Yes, I want everybody's consent. It has to be a two-way communication, not a monologue. Can we start our analysis for today? I will start from a point where everything makes sense. Good to see you, Sri Lakshmi. You are obviously writing the examination. So please do pay attention to a lot of things which I'm going to talk about. If there's one question coming out of this area, it is good enough. And in that regard, best for you that you don't have to go through 40 45 hours of any course. You can easily do it here with me. Now, let's talk about where our syllabus starts from. Now, what the UPSC syllabus says is events of 18th century. But the problem is that if I start in 18th century, none of it will make sense and you will never be able to understand where does the American Revolution understanding come through, which is what is the American Revolution, where is the what is the concept of the 13 colonies, what is navigation acts, what is this age of discovery, What is the new world concept? A lot is riding on a lot of context, which is you have to go beyond history, GS to optional level to then bring in a lot of context, which I will try to give you in 20-25 minutes. And within that frame, you should be able to understand the larger concepts in that regard, which will allow you to then understand American Revolution mostly does not make sense because American Revolution has a lot of context behind it. Same way, French Revolution will not make sense if you don't understand American Revolution because both of them are connected. And Industrial Revolution, as it is a topic out of which we've got multiple questions, multiple times based on either impact, cause, or why Britain, why Europe, and we'll try to concentrate on those areas also. So, our story, we have to reach to a point which is called 1492, which is the discovery of the New World. Now, what do I mean by New World? See, there is something called Old World, which is Europe. Then Africa was also known to the Europeans. And thereafter, there was something called the Orient, which is India and China together. However, the old world, the Europeans, did not know what is across the Atlantic. And there's a reason for that because it was based on that knowledge system that people did not go across the Atlantic or into deep sea too much. And that is where we have to understand how did a civilization which was based on the concept of flat earth and edge of the earth concept go to a point where they will become the most, you can say, active mariners or voyagers, or what is called as age of discovery will come through in Europe itself. And that is a transition which is critical for us to understand where America fits in that and the new world comes through. Now, for that, we have to go a little bit back. Where we have to start is feudalism. You must have heard about this word feudalism multiple times in the Indian context, but we're talking about the real feudalism, the European feudalism. And feudalism, which dominated 12th, 13th century till mid 14th century in that regard, has a very important bearing on what the knowledge system was in Europe. Now, what do we mean by feudalism? Feudalism means a pyramidal structure which used to exist in European society and polity, where you had the king at the apex. Thereafter, we had the knights, then the vassals, or what are called as landlords, and last is the peasants or bonded peasants in what are called as serfs, serfdom as it was called. Now here it's a purely decentralized system. The king controls the knights control the landlord, and the landlord control the serfs. That is why decentralization is mostly called as feudalistic tendency. But what is more important is a parallel state used to exist, which is called the church. Called the church. The church used to control society, used to control the knowledge system, and it had 100% control over behavior, the morality, the ethics of the European sector itself. And this is where what you have to understand is that when they have 100% control, the king is also in a way a puppet of the church. Meaning, if the king wants to do something, he has to take the permission of the church. And here the pope, what is called as the papacy, becomes very important. He controls everything. And this is the structure where the church used to argue in what is called as scholasticism. Scholasticism is a word which is used for the knowledge system which the church produces. And that is based on the idea that the earth was nothing but a disk. And over this disk, there was a dome. And in this dome, the sun and the moon keep on moving around. At the same time, we were calculating under Aryabhatta the circumference of the Earth itself and talking about what was called the idea of eclipse and how the sun and the Earth are moving together. And we already know that it was a geoid or a sphere. These regressive Europeans thought that the Earth was flat, and that is why they never used to go beyond a certain point into the waters, because they used to think that they will fall off the horizon. They will fall off the horizon. This was the church's understanding, that you don't explore too much. Don't explore too much. You can just hug the coast, and that is why nobody was ready to cross over into the Atlantic sector to reach to the Americas. The Americas did exist, but to the Europeans, it never existed because they had not seen it. And the church, the papal system, used to perpetuate this idea that the earth was flat. And this is where Greek knowledge, Indian knowledge was extremely sophisticated. The same people who said that Indian knowledge is inferior to European knowledge, they are a brainchild of this type of discourse in that regard. But now the question is, if that is the case, what changed? How did these same feudal church minded Europeans become so conscious of the fact that we have to now explore? And this is where there will be a series of events which will happen in Europe, which in turn will lead to a change in order, a change in understanding, which in turn will then transpire into what is today called as the age of discovery. Now, the first is called absolutism. The first event which started to make the grip of the church loose from what we call as the knowledge system, from the society, from the polity. That is absolutism. Now, what is absolutism? See, in the era of, and these events are happening parallelly, but I am giving you them in gradational understanding, so that there's some form of continuity for you. When we talk about absolutism, what does absolutism mean? Absolutism mean when the king started to get frustrated. They started to get frustrated by how the church used to dictate everything to them. And they were like, enough is enough. I want to now consolidate power into my own hands. And this is where across Europe, there will be something called the absolutist monarchies, which will start to rise. When these absolutist monarchies will start to rise, what is going to happen is that they will now start to concentrate power within the king, and the concept of divine kingship will come. That you, the church, who are you to tell me I should be the king? I have been told by God that I am the king. And when the divine kingship concept comes through, what happens is, if we are quantifying the control of the church over society, there is a certain decline. So if church used to control 100% of all the institutions, it reduces by 20%, and now they have a grip of only 80%. I'm giving you this understanding so that you can quantify it in your understanding and also use it as a metrics in that regard. The supremacy of the church has, in a way, wavered around. The grip has gone through because the absolutist monarchs want the power in themselves. They don't want to be dictated by the church too much, and that creates a space of 20%. And this space, this church authority fading away little bit only, but this space allowed for what is called as the rise and revival of Greek knowledge, or Greco-Roman knowledge as it was called. And Greco-Roman knowledge revivalism in world history is called as the Renaissance. The Renaissance. So, Renaissance is the, it's not a political movement, it is a cultural movement, which is the revival of Greco-Roman knowledge. And you already know that the Greco-Romans had an understanding because they had been reading a lot about the Indian knowledge system. They had an understanding of the Earth being a sphere. The idea that it is not a flat surface itself. Renaissance is going to lead to two things in Europe. This is the second event which will be very, very important. Renaissance will produce what is called as the concept of humanism and the concept of individualism. If any of you is history optional, you are getting a small crash course on history optional in that regard also. This is purely optional territory, but something very important for a GS student to write any good answer. Now, what does individualism mean? Individual means that the concept within theology, God is everything. But now within the Renaissance, the argument came through that man is also important. The Renaissance started to take away the focus away from God towards the men, towards humans. And that is where the concept of humanism comes through, that humans have agency. And that is why you must have noticed there is a new concept which is called humanities which emerges. What is humanities? Humanities subjects are history, political science, sociology, anthropology. Why? Because they are the study of humans. The study of human past is nothing but history. The study of human society is sociology. The study of human culture is anthropology. The study of human political systems is called political science. So therefore, humanism is a new knowledge which now starts to impact and challenge what is called as scholasticism. So now the church's authority in that regard has been further challenged. And now that it has been further challenged, humanism is going to be considered a new ideology which allows for focus on humans and human agency. Now, in itself, the Renaissance is not something out of the box. But what is more important is what it leads to. What Renaissance leads to is a chain reaction. First being what is called as the Reformation. Reformation is nothing but Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King, Martin Luther in Germany getting frustrated by the corruption within the church itself, which is called the sale of indulgences. And therefore, they were extremely frustrated by the fact that how the church used to misuse authority. And that is where the Reformation played a very important role in reforming the church itself. So if church authority was 100%, became 80%, now it became 60%. And Reformation is going to be a revolution from within, a revolution from within which is going to challenge the church itself. And this is where Martin Luther, you have Calvin in France, Germany, and even the Tudors will make England an Anglican nation. Anglican means they will become what today we call them as Protestants. So, the idea of the Catholic and the Protestant church will come through from the Reformation. Now, the Reformation is a major blow to the church because within the Protestant church itself, you had humanism and individualism inbuilt. And that is where Reformation is going to lead to the fourth and the fifth event, which is very, very important. What I'm doing right now is giving you context, which is what is called as the age of scientific revolution, and thereafter what is called as the age of discovery. Now, I will let you know why am I having this conversation. But age of scientific revolution is based on the ideas of Kepler, Galileo, and Newton. The idea that the earth is not in a way controlled by divine laws, but natural laws. The idea that the earth is not the center of the universe, but it is moving around the sun itself. The idea that it is a sphere. Further, what will develop is the compass, the telescope, the magnetic needle, and that will in turn lead to very big, you can say, strides in navigation. And that is why, because these processes did not happen in the Indian subcontinent or in China, We did not become explorers, but we were having a very flourishing trade in the Arabian Sea. The Europeans will become obsessed. And that is where we have a whole set of what is called as discoveries and a whole set of explorers. We already know that one of them landed in India, which is Vasco da Gama. But in 1492, what Christopher Columbus will do is he will cross over the Atlantic, reach to the Caribbean islands. He did not reach to Americas per se, but to the Caribbean islands, come back and say, tell the world that there is something called the New World across the Atlantic. And that is where you will have Amerigo Vespucci, who will finally reach the Gulf of Mexico or America, whatever you want to call it. And therein where the name America from Amerigo. And thereafter, it will be Magellan who will forever change the understanding for the Europeans that the earth is flat, because he will circumvent the earth itself. You don't need to know these men, but what you need to understand is that for the Europeans, this was a new unexplored territory in that regard, where they were now going on long 3 months, 4 months, 5 months long voyages. Now, why is this so important? It's because this is where the American context comes through. Where our story starts in American Revolution is the 13 colonies of the British in America itself. Now, you need to understand one thing very clearly, that it is the chain of events from absolutist monarchy to Renaissance to Reformation to scientific revolution to the concept of discovery that in turn leads to something like this. He further, rather, we have to also further understand that this will allow for the colonialism or imperialism to spread into India also. Because first Diaz is going to reach to the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, and then 1498 finally Vasco da Gama will reach Calicut. That's a separate tangent itself, which is called modern India in that regard. But we are concentrating on the New World. Now, because most of this was funded by the Spanish and the Portuguese, one of the first colonies to develop was of the Spanish and the Portuguese only. You had Portugal here, today Brazil. Then Spain was across this sector. The most of Latin America was with the Spanish. Here again, the Spanish held most of these areas. Most of these areas. The French were here, and what they were looking for is nothing but the three G: God, glory, and gold. Which is, they were doing it for glory, they were doing it for gold, they were doing it for the idea that we are going to spread across and bring the concept of resources, and even we will spread Christianity into this sector. Yes, there will be the Treaty of Tordesillas, which is going to divide this into two parts, wherein there will be a line. That is why the Spanish will never come to India. East Indies, West Indies concept is going to come through. But the idea is, I really don't care in this story about the French, the Spanish, or the Portuguese. What I care about is what the English do, because all history is British centric, at least for Indian context. That is where we have to understand how do they develop these colonies, and these 13 colonies is our focus. Do we understand why did I give you this context for the past 20 minutes? Because I need to discuss with you the 13 colonies. The American Revolution is nothing but the revolution within these 13 colonies, and what happened within this sector, which in turn led to the first democratic state to develop across the world itself by 1776, by 1783, if you want. Now, these areas were conquered by or colonized by the British. The British were the most lethargic when it comes to finding Americas or even finding any form of colonies there. That is why the sector which they hold, which is the eastern coast, is the worst of the worst. Why? Because you have the Appalachian Mountains here, and in this sector, what you can only produce is corn. Little bit of fur is there if you go for hunting, but it is not resource rich. Unlike these sectors where you had a lot of gold, silver, a lot of diamonds, and even a lot of other resources which could be used, This was only you can say inhabited by red Indians as they were called, but they are the ones who taught them that how to grow corn in that regard, in that sense. But the idea is this was an economically unviable colony. And the whole story of the American Revolution is how did these 13 colonies, which were mostly useless, became viable, and then the British tried to extract too much, that in turn led to the American Revolution. So, so we have now reached to a point where you understand what I mean by the American colonies, the 13 colonies itself, and what is the age of discovery. Are we on the same page here? I want everybody's consent here that we understand this much. That what is the concept of 13 colonies, and how did the same Europeans who did not want to cross over the Atlantic now became the biggest explorers in the world itself. Yes, great. Now, the American sector, the 13 American British colonies, they are more or less useless, meaning their economic value, and colonialism is all about economic exploitation. Their economic value was extreme, you can say low, and the British, if they had to do something about America, they had to develop the American colonies in such a way that they become part of the world trade itself. And this is where you have the British American colonies. They can produce a lot of commodities which the English want, and these commodities would be rubber, because certain parts of it was in the tropical sector. They can produce cocoa, which is nothing but the concept of chocolate, but chocolate is later. Then they can produce sugar cane. They can also produce coffee, and they can produce cotton. Right? But the problem with British America is land is abundant, but labor is very scarce. The population here is very low. So they need to figure out the labor issue. And this is where Africa comes through. And what the English did was they developed one of the brutalest triangular trade in world history itself, which is called as the Middle Passage. The English used to take luxury goods, guns, and different types of, you can say, not specifically essential items, but what is called as cotton plus muslin plus, you can say, luxury items. All of this was in lot of demand in Africa for the tribes who had a very problematic tendency. Their problematic tendency was when two tribes used to fight. For example, Zulu and Ashanti have fought with together one another. If Ashanti win, they will take the Zulu tribe as POWs, prisoners of war. And the Africans were ready to sell these POWs in exchange of these commodities. So what the English used to do is that they used to take guns and luxury items to Africa. From Africa, they used to take men and women called as slaves. And these slaves were then used in the British American plantations to produce sugar, cotton, etc. And this is called the concept of the Middle Passage, or the triangular trade between England, Africa, and North America, specifically the British colony. Slaves used to go towards the Caribbean islands and towards the North American sector. This is one of the worst black slavery, chattel slavery, based on the concept that you have an idea of commodity for men and women itself. On the other hand, you have raw materials which are needed or finished goods needed in England flowing through. And England is taking manufactured goods and guns to Africa itself. This is the triangular trade which made these colonies economically viable. So the economic viability of the North American sector was purely based on the understanding that there has to be a triangular trade in this sector. And therefore, the problem which there was that the economic value was very low. But what they did was by producing something like this, they made this sector economically viable for themselves. Now, once they became economically viable, there were multiple acts which the British applied on the British American sector. For example, they could never produce wool because wool could be only brought in from the English sector. They could never produce hats because they wanted a monopoly of the English manufacturer in America itself, that hats should only be imported. Further, iron could never be produced. Iron had to be imported. But how the British used to control this sector is called Navigation Acts. I'll tell you why am I discussing this with you, because the American Revolution is nothing but a change in behavior. And that behavior, a behavioral change is going to come when the Navigation Acts are going to be seen as problematic. So the Navigation Acts used to dictate the relationship. So let's talk about America, British America. And on the other hand, we have the English. Then we have the rest of the world in that regard. Now, what did the Navigation Act say? Because the English had made British America viable, the first rule was any ship which used to operate in this sector, any ship, had to be an English ship, meaning it had to be registered or had to be in a way licensed by an Englishman. This was to make sure that the English shipbuilding industry was very well established and very well, you can say, placed in this larger. But what actually bothered the Americans later, and what was the most regressive provision within the Navigation Acts, was that if the British Americans wanted to sell to the rest of the world or take from the rest of the world something, for example, the British wanted the wines and the rest of the world wanted British cotton, American cotton, this trade was not allowed. This trade was not allowed. Any trade between the rest of the world and British America, meaning these 13 colonies, this sector, had to go through England in both directions, meaning no direct connection between Europe and British America was allowed. This sector could not trade with this sector. It could only trade via England. And then the question is, why? The reason for that is they were getting import duty, export duty, both sides. So the British, and leave it to a Britisher to find a way to exploit a place, they made all of this relevant to the concept of the Navigation Act. So if I now assess everything together, if I now assess everything together, the Navigation Acts and the British together, they produce a small amount of revenue, and that is through the import and export duty. At the same point of time, the Americans or British Americans, they are connected to the world trade via the British Empire. They will also be getting connected to India very soon. But this is what is called the 1650s, 1700, 1720s. Does this make sense? What is the way, or in what way did the British make this sector economically viable? An area which was more or less useless now was made a part of the larger seaborne trade, and they wanted to generate something. And that generation came through import export duty. Everything has to go via the English sector because that is critical. Are we clear about this? I want everybody's yes here or consent here, because from this point forward, now the American Revolution actually is coming to our context. Everything till this point is context building, meaning I cannot teach you American Revolution without having this conversation. So the first 35 minutes, what you have seen is all resources, all personalities, all experts will more or less not talk about these concepts. They will not talk about navigation acts. They will not talk about the concept of British America. They will not talk about age of discovery. And that is where when they automatically say to you stamp act, it makes no sense whatsoever. And a question on American Revolution can only be answered if there is a bigger understanding and a better understanding in that. They were clever and very, very intelligent because they were in a way desperate to find something. When was Navigation Act brought in? First time, for the first time, in 1650. 1650, in some form it was there already, but from 1650s onwards they had a proper policy in that regard. But from 1550 onwards, they were making sure all trade in the Americas was controlled by the Britishers. Something very similar which they were doing in India also, which is they wanted to be all the points of channels so that the channel of drain was very big. Now, let's assess something. Let's assess something, which is the attitude of the Britishers and the British Americans, because at the end of the day, all the inhabitants of America are nothing but Britishers only. It is white on white, remember this point, and that is going to explain a lot of things later. You will see British Americans. What is their attitude in 1720, or we'll say 1700? If we talk about British Americans, they are happy. It's a win win situation. They are happy. They have to pay taxes, but these taxes are mostly by they are paid by the merchants, and these are paid in the form of import and export duty. So it is an indirect tax paid by 10 or 15% of the population. Import export duties which they are paying, but the British Americans think that that is the cost of being part of the empire. So they were obliged that no, we should not say anything to the Britishers. Yes, they were Britishers first, then Americans. That we should not say anything. They are connecting us to the world. And on the other hand, if I talk about the British attitude, the British attitude is equally interesting. Their attitude is that, see, they had not invested too much. They had just connected them to the world. So, with no or real investment, anything which came, be it the revenue, this was acceptable. It was a win win situation. The best example of this is, for example, you have done a course for 3 years, and the cost of that course is 15,000. Now, if after doing that course you will sit at home, your parents will not say anything to you, nothing, because their investment was near zero. So therefore, they don't expect you to get a 40 LPA or 1 crore salary based understanding. Whatever they can get from you. If you get a 20, 30,000 rupees salary based, you can say, job, they will be happy. The idea was we have put no real investment. So therefore, whatever we get is enough. That is the British attitude. British are the parents here, and you are British America. You are happy that you're doing the course and you are staying in Delhi. They are happy that they're not pushing a lot of money, and the return on investment be whatever. Everybody is happy. It's a happy family, pure happy family. The British Americans, as Sri Lakshmi said, were Britishers first, and the Britishers were like, as it is, we are now expanding in India at this point of time. By 1717, they will get the Farooq Siyar Farman. So they were like, ki, okay, okay, I have pushed in nothing. I am getting whatever. So if you have a coupon for a free sandwich, you really don't care if that sandwich is a veg sandwich or a paneer sandwich or a chicken sandwich. Simple. कुछ भी मिल रहा है ले लेते. So it is very simple. Now it is this relationship which will sour and become problematic, which in turn will lead to the American Revolution. Now, what changed? And what changed, or what changed everything, was 7 years. See, you would know something called the Austrian War of Secession. If you've done modern India, you would know this. I have taught you multiple times now. The Austrian War of Secession was the war between Maria Theresa and Frederick over who is going to rule Austrian Empire. Maria Theresa's father had brought in decrees which said that a woman can rule, but Frederick, coming from Bavaria, said that that cannot be. And this is where, in between 1740 to 48, the British, the French took sides in this. And in India, the first Carnatic War happened because of this only. But when the Austrian War Secession happened, it did not spill over into America. However, when the Austrian War Succession issue is going to get you can say reinvigorated, reignited with the death of Maria Theresa, this will lead to, in between 1756 and 63, what is called as the 7 Years' War. Now, this 7 Years' War is going to change the relationship of the British and the Americans in a very, very big way. Now, two things will happen together. The first is between 1700 and 1756. There will be the influence on the Americans, British Americans, what is called as the Enlightenment, a movement which started in France, which was headed by Voltaire, Rousseau, Kant, Montesquieu, Diderot. And their argument was that the state is not a given, it is a social contract. Yes, Locke. And the idea was that we create the state does not create the power itself. Divine kingship, absolutism was now being questioned. And the concept of civil liberties, fundamental rights, all these concepts were now coming through. And the Americans will start to read about it, which is they will start to understand, okay, the state is a social contract between everyone who give up little bit of their rights in order to create a state itself. Further, they started to understand what is liberty, freedom, what is representation. And the idea of representation is going to in turn lead to the British Americans to now start to develop an understanding which is going to be called the American ethic. The Americans still talk about this concept today, the American ethic, the American dream. And the Americans will kill you for their liberty. That is their biggest level of hypocrisy in that regard. What the Americans are doing for liberty in Iran today, in Ukraine today, in that regard. But the idea is very simple. The idea was American ethic is based on reason, rationalism, liberty, self assurance, optimism. And these are new concepts which will start to get ingrained into the minds of the Americans. And there is no one book, Deepika, that is the biggest issue. There is no one book for world history. So, therefore, the American ethic will in turn become an idea of liberty. Till today, they talk about this, right? The concept of liberty, the concept. In the name of democracy, they have destabilized the West Asian sector, but that is their liberty. They have the liberty to destroy the world, and that is their liberty. So, therefore, what happens is that the British American starts to change. So, whilst all of this is happening, the American is changing. And from a British American, he has started to become more conscious of the idea that I'm an American first, then a British. Now, what is even more interesting is what is going to happen is once the 7 years war is going to happen, a conflict which will be based on again the same issue between Bavaria and the Austrian sector, between Maria Theresa and the Frederick Angle. And this war is going to spread across the world. Unlike the Austrian War of Succession, the 7 years war is going to spread across the Atlantic into the New World also. And this in turn will create an issue for the British because the French were sitting in the north, as I showed you. The French were sitting in the north, and now there is pressure from the French and the Spanish on these 13 colonies. And therefore, what is going to happen is that in the process of protecting the Americas, third Carnatic War is going to happen in India, but in the process of protecting the Americas, a huge debt will be created in Britain. And though the peace treaty, which is going to happen after the English will again win, which is the Paris Treaty or the Peace of Paris or the Treaty of Paris itself, again related to the Third Carnatic War in history, the British will be able to come back to the status quo. The French will cease to be a problem in India. But the idea was that now the British had invested quite a lot in this sector. Obviously, there will be investment. You have to send arms, ammunition, and therefore, what this 7 years war has done, what this 7 years war has done is two things. Understand this point. See, the American already was developing his ethic to enlightenment. Now, what war does most in most cases is war unites, and it united the 13 colonies together, and the American identity became more pronounced. On the other hand, the 7 years war had increased the expenditure of the British. And you have to understand one thing very clearly. Now their investment was huge. Now you have to understand 7 years war leads to an attitudinal change. An attitudinal change in 1765, and by 1763 this attitudinal change was in place. And that attitudinal change is Americans recognize themselves as Americans first, make America great again. And the word British had now been dropped. But the Britishers, they wanted more. This is where George III and his Prime Minister, Lord North, is going to come into context. Now, this is the case where your course was for 50 lakh rupees. Your parents invested a lot of money in your education. And then if you are going to say, I want to find myself, I will make videos, my calling is travel vlogging, I would like to travel the world to find my own thoughts, I need time for introspection. All these words, when you will say, they will literally throw you out of the house. Because they will say, our investment into your studies was 50 lakh rupees. Now, in that case, now you need to get a job which gives you something back out of that money. So they did not invest 50 lakh rupees for you to become spiritually oriented and finding yourself in the European sector. And this is where the British attitude has totally changed. Previously, the British said, I did not apply, I did not invest anything, whatever I'm getting is enough. Now, the British and specifically George the Third said that we need to now recover this cost of defense and debt. And this is where the British will start to do some things which they were not doing previously. And that chain reaction is called the American Revolution. That chain reaction is called the American Revolution. Now, what is that chain reaction which we called as American Revolution and how does it start? So, what I've done for you till this point is I've given you fodder for the concept of an introduction. An introduction in the American context or American Revolution context has to be the attitudinal change from 1763 onwards. Previously, the British were happy, the British Americans were happy, they were accepting everything. But thereafter, the idea changes. And thereafter, when the British want more, as they did from India also, they will now do things which will trigger the revolution. And this whole event is now going to be a merry-go-round, a certain up down incident, which we're going to discuss. But before I do that, I want everybody's consent. I am not presuming anything. I'm giving you everything at the most basic level. You should at least know where is America on the map. That is the only assumption I have. Right? Do I have everybody's consent that you are following how the Enlightenment changes the understanding, how the 7 Years' War increases the cost, and that is where the attitudinal change comes. So any question, any cause for American Revolution has to mention the 7 Years' War as a turning point in this relationship. Very good. Now, everybody has to come on. Yes. Now, the first action which they did, other than the concept of the writs of assistance, which is they were searching ships for smuggling, the first major understanding where the British wanted to now get more. Yes, the attitude is because of the cost of the war. Red Indians have been systematically exterminated via either disease or war. Now, the first major change is in what is called as the Molasses Act. Has a nationalism started? Yes, it is going to come through Chirag. Just 1 second, one event more, and the concept of economic nationalism will come. Molasses Act, or what is called as Jaggery Good. Molasses Act of 1733 said that if an American is buying from a Spanish molasses, French molasses from the West Indies, there was no cost. However, the Molasses Act was amended in 1764 to add a concept. And that concept was if you buy from the French or the Spanish, you have to pay more. You have to pay a 6 pence duty. But if you buy from the British West Indies, you don't do it. But if you realize one, till this point, all taxation has been on the merchants. Navigation Act, Molasses Act, the concept of import duty, the concept of any form of duty was paid by the merchants. I think you can understand this point that be it from 1650 till 1764, all taxes have been paid by merchants only. That is why everyone else was happy. They didn't care. All form of taxation was out of only one community or one social category in the form of tariffs. Beautiful. Now, the British say that this is not enough. And the second reason and the trigger for the American Revolution comes in the form of what is called as the Stamp Act. Sure, sure. Shreya, you can ask these questions here. Now, what is the Stamp Act? The Stamp Act said any form of legal document, newspaper, book, court document, deed, anything needs a stamp from the British authority in America, and that would have a cost. It is still an indirect tax, but the problem is Stamp Act affects everyone. It does not just affect the merchants, it affects everyone. Meaning, imagine kya, we in India still pay stamp duty. We pay stamp duty. Stamp duty has to be paid on anything and everything. You must have made anti-ragging stamp duty based affidavits. We all make affidavits in our lives. That is done on a stamp duty or stamp paper as it is called. Stamp paper exists in India today also, but and it impacts everyone. Same way from merchant based taxation, the British, in their desperation to take out more, go for what is called as a generic tax on all forms of legal documents. And this is where the Americans lose their mind. They will lose their mind. How? See, the 7 Years' War, as I told you, had two impacts, right? The British want more, and in that desperation, they will introduce the Stamp Act. The American, on the other hand, has become more and more conscious of his own existence. He is now an enlightened citizen. And for him, Stamp Act was a transgression. Till 1765, all taxation was on merchants. If today the government of India says that, though it will never, but the idea is if the government of India says that I will only tax Ambani's, Adani's, the Birlas, only tax them, will not say anything, will be happy. And how does it matter to you? If it says that we will only tax people who have salary more than 50 crores a year, so most of India will rejoice and say, hi, we don't care. That is what was happening before 1765. All taxes were paid by the merchants. All taxes were paid by the merchants. So people were like, how does it matter to me? Merchants are paying it. Maybe that is the cost of it. But now imagine that government of India says anybody who earns more than 10,000 rupees per month has to pay 5% additional taxes. Now, Didi can do that. But the idea is if that happens, it affects everyone. Though I'm talking about direct taxation, this indirect form of taxation has now created a context which affects everyone. Because be it church documentation, almanacs, be it any form of land deed, or be it anything, everybody has to pay stamp duty. And now the British Americans, or rather, don't use the word bourgeoisie here, Chirag. I've seen you use it twice. Don't use the word bourgeoisie. Bourgeoisie is not a consumer. Bourgeoisie is a merchant, or you can say a commercial class. But bourgeoisie is not a word which comes through right now. It is a very French evolution based word. So this affects everyone. And as soon as the Americans get to know that we have to pay this tax, they will now call out to the British. They will say, Voltaire, Rousseau, and the Enlightenment has taught us something. What is that? If you want to tax us, you should represent us, which is the concept of no taxation without representation. See, today, the IT department, the finance minister, Nirmala ji can tax me because I am represented by my MP and MLA in the parliament and the state legislature. As much as he would not care or does not know or does not actually represent my interest in that regard, but prima facie, in representative democracy, I have voted for that person. And therefore, I am represented. So I can be taxed, which is taxation with representation. Now the Americans start to say that we Americans, not British Americans, we Americans are not represented within the British Parliament. And if we are not represented within the Parliament, how can you tax us? How can you tax us? So the community's right not to be taxed except from its elected representatives is now going to become the point where economic nationalism will rise. So the concept of their nationalism is based on economic nationalism, which is you have been exploiting us, we were not saying. You were exploiting our merchants, we did not say. But now you have to either give us representation in the House of Commons. If not, you cannot tax us. That is why this is the no taxation without representation is going to become one of the biggest UN cries of the century in that regard. Now, the Americans, the British will say, no, we will not let you get represented in the House of Commons. You are a colony. You are a colony. And if you are a colony, you will not get representation. And therefore, now what is going to happen is now the British Americans or the Americans will come on the streets. A new body is going to be created, which is called the Sons of Liberty. This Sons of Liberty was the organization which will now lead. This is the stamp duties if you want to see them. This is where now there will be boycott. 27 delegates from the 9 major colonies out of the 13 will meet. They will say, we will not buy British goods until unless it is the act is not repealed itself. And this is where the sense of American identity and unity is going to come through. And the merchants who had previously been exploited are now going to become the leaders, wherein they will say that there is something which was always wrong, but now the people understand. And the hue and cry of the Sons of Liberty is going to be liberty, property. Now, this is where the Stamp Act backfired on the British badly. Badly. It was pure backlash. So they brought in Stamp Act and the people came on the streets. Sons of Liberty was created. Boycott came through. No taxation without representation concept came through. But you have to understand one thing. Now their economic exploitation got political expression. When their economic exploitation gets political expression, it is where that the British have already done a blunder. So there is no way of coming back from here. This can be called like the partition of Bengal type moment in American history. Once partition of Bengal happened in India, there was no coming back with regards to the identity formation and extremism. Same way, once Stamp Act was brought in and stamped, the concept of no taxation without representation came through. Now there was no way they were going to come back from it. The British, what they did was, they did repeal the act. And this is where you have to understand one thing. White on white violence is very different. We asked for the repealing of the Rowlatt Act for a very long time. Never did the British do anything. We asked for a lot of things, but the British never did it. But because British American is also white, and they are also white, this white on white concept is very different. So if you have this innocent question that why did the Americans or why did the Britishers listen to the Americans? Because at the end of the day, they are their own. And colonialism is based on the concept of white man's burden. But there's no burden on a white man from a white man itself. And that is why they repealed the act. There was a de escalation. So, if there was an escalation, they de escalated. De escalated. Which is quite unlike the Britishers. Quite unlike the Britishers. So, now if they ask you one question on the causes, first cause is the 7 Years' War. Second cause is nothing but the concept of Stamp Act. De-escalation happens. In the process of de-escalation, they will go back to merchant taxation, which is called Townshend duties. Called Townshend duty. What is Townshend duties? Townshend duties was we will tax and control the smuggling which was happening in order to evade the Navigation Act. And in this process, two regiments were placed in Boston and other harbors. And this is going to lead to an event which is considered to be, should be considered in Indian history as a joke. This is called the Boston Massacre. So, what happens is when, firstly, it should not be called a massacre, I'll tell you. When the British appoint the regiments in Boston, a hotspot for the Sons of Liberty, some teenagers started to tease the Britishers. They started to throw snowballs. They started to say, "Oh, Britisher, go back." They started to say that you are useless. Your king is useless. We Americans are better. So teasing started to happen. Now, this teasing in turn led to the British using what they know best, which is they used force, which is that the British fired upon these men. And unfortunately, very sad news. I was shocked to hear how many people died. Five people were, and it is called Boston Massacre. More people have died between the time we started this conversation at 8 o'clock till 9:06 in India today. And at this point of time, more people were dying because of famines in India in minutes. But we don't call that a massacre. But ये तो massacre है ना, Boston Massacre. Five people dead because of police fire, because of the regiments firing on the people in America. But white men died, na? White men died. So it is a massacre. Now, as soon as Boston Massacre happens, they had to again remove the regiments, and they basically then de-escalated again. So what happens is, if you look at the larger ebb and flow, there are escalation, de-escalation, escalation, de-escalation. But the Boston Massacre is considered to be the third reason where there was some form of violence which entered into this relationship. We can say that British wanted to make more money out of whether they did it, wanted to oppress them because eventually Americans died some. In a way, Shreya, but the attitudinal change was there for sure. So Stamp Act was a led to what is called as the Stamp Act protests. They de-escalated with Townshend duties. Townshend duties in turn led to one more escalation, which is called Boston Massacre, so-called massacre, and that in turn led to the Townshend regiments to be withdrawn. Everybody is with me till this point? You understand how Stamp Act protest is the second reason, 7 Years War is the first reason, and Boston Massacre is the third reason. Are we on the same page here? Everyone, come on. Because it is now going to become more and more interesting, but we are reaching to the end point of the concept of American Revolution, right? Okay. Now, in this story, things are going to become a little bit, you can say, calmer, but the next escalation is going to not come because of the Americans or the Britishers. It is going to come because of someone else, but Clive, who were in the regiment, British regiments. Now, I don't know how many of you know it, Britishers or Americans. Britishers. I don't know how many of you know this concept, which is called the Clivian fiscal bubble. You've been part of my course if you've done Modern India with me, or somewhere you've watched any form of video. I always talk about something called Clivian fiscal bubble. Clivian fiscal bubble is, yes, the crash of the East India Company stock because of the concept of him overestimating the revenue from Bengal. So when the Diwani rights was given, Clive overestimated the revenue out of Bengal, which in turn led to two things. Famines in Bengal in 1769 and 70. At the same point of time, he will overestimate the revenue which will come out of the Bengal sector. East India Company stock price will start to go up because dividend was expected more. Once there will be overassessment and nothing will really come out, the stock price crashes. And that crash is called the Caribbean fiscal bubble bursting. When the Caribbean fiscal bubble burst, East India Company, which was gaining crores of rupees in India, was now applying for a loan with the British Parliament, claiming what is called as bankruptcy. And now the East India Company was in a crisis. And the American connection here is, at the end of the day, East India Company is the child of the British. अपना ही बच्चा है. So they needed to do something so that the East India Company comes out of the crisis itself. And this is where they will introduce what is called as the Tea Act in America. We know what is going to happen in India. Clive will be recalled back. Hastings is going to go through. But to make sure that the East India Company can revive some money out of the crash itself, the Tea Act is introduced in America. Now, under the Tea Act, it's very easy. It's very straightforward. What is the Tea Act? Tea Act says that the East India Company can import and export tea into Americas without paying any duty. And this is a major setback for American merchants and for anybody other than the British and the East India Company. Why? Because if today I say that Tatas can sell cars without paying GST and everyone else has to pay GST, you know which car is going to be sold the most. Why? Because that will reduce the amount of or the price of that commodity very drastically. Now, this was unacceptable to the Americans. They said, how can you do something like this? And this is where the tea crisis will in turn transpire into what is called as the Boston Tea Party. So when the East India Company ships are going to be coming through into American docks, the the people will not allow the docking of the ship in multiple places. But in one place where the Americans are going to protest, but the governor Hutchinson is going to insist, is Boston. Boston already a certain hotspot. Now the ship is going to be docked into the Boston harbor. The, the people are going to now, and the Sons of Liberty will now board the ship and throw the tea into the harbor. And the harbor will now start to become a little bit more browner because of the tea itself. And that is called the Boston Tea Party. As seen here, the tea is thrown into the harbor itself. And the amount of tea which was thrown was very expensive because it was 10,000 pounds worth of tea, close to 4 million pounds today. And this is where this relationship will fall out properly. Because previously, in most cases, there was a de-escalation. So in Stamp Act, which led to protests, there was a de-escalation in Townshend duty. Then there was an escalation, Boston Massacre. There was a de-escalation, Townshend duty regiments were recalled back. Then there is Tea Act. Tea Act leads to Boston Tea Party. Now, according to this pattern, the Britishers should have de-escalated. But George III said, enough, enough, enough. We can't let these Americans dictate everything to. And this is where the American Revolution will reach to its highest point, which is called as the Intolerable Acts, or what is called as the Coercive Act, introduced by the British. Under this, there will be 4 to 5 very important provisions. And that provision is going to be, first, in Boston, no ship can dock itself till the Bostoners don't pay for the tea which they've thrown. 10,000 pounds worth. Second, they then amended the Administrative Act of 1691 to give all the power to the British appointed governors. Further, they said that the military will now stay in the homes of the people. And then they also introduced something in Canada called the Quebec Act. And therein, for the first time, the Britishers allowed the Catholic Church to establish its presence. most of the Britisher or the Americans are Protestants, and the Catholic Church getting some form of presence in the north of America was considered problematic. And this is where the Americans say these are intolerable acts. The British had done worse to us. We had called multiple acts intolerable, but we didn't get a concession from the British. But for the Americans, this is a unacceptable act, coercive act. And this in turn will lead to the American Revolution reaching to its culmination, which is called the formation of the First Continental Congress. After this, what starts is the American War of Independence. That is of no purpose to you. It is optional level understanding. American Revolution ends with the Declaration of Independence, and the American War of Independence and Constitution making starts thereafter. That is of no that is not mentioned in your syllabus in any way. In Philadelphia, on 5th September 1774, the First Continental Congress will meet. Radicals will say, let's just remove our relationship with the British. Moderates are going to say that let's compromise with the British. First Continental Congress is a moment in which the 13 colonies have come together with 56 representatives, and now they started to give political expression to their understanding. The British are not going to back down. There will be multiple clashes which will happen, and a continental association will be formed. The Continental Association had to now basically have a certain program under which they had to boycott the British goods. They had to also stop trading with the Great British, and they had to now also, in a way, make sure that their relationship is properly sorted out. The idea was, what should be the relationship? When the British are not going to actually properly respond to anything, then the Second Continental Congress will meet. And by this time, Jefferson and Franklin had entered. Continental Army under the first president of the Americans, George Washington, is going to be formed. And thereafter, from 1776 to 1783, they will fight what is called as the American War of Independence. That was also based on a pamphlet which said common sense. It was called Common Sense, that it is common sense that we become an independent nation. And in a series of declarations in 1776, on 4th of July, which is considered their Independence Day, the Declaration of Independence as drafted by Thomas Jefferson was accepted, thereby leading to now a struggle between 1776 to 1783. Now, what is the American Revolution? A question which must be coming is the American Revolution. See, the American Revolution is nothing but a moment of economic nationalism, a moment of a struggle between the Americans and the British over their exploitation. 13 colonies set became free. United States of America is going to be formed, of the first democratic republic in the world itself. And there are multiple reasons for the American Revolution. First is the 7 Years' War. Second, Stamp Act. Third, Boston Massacre. Fourth, the Act. Thereafter, the Intolerable Act. And fourth is the formation of the Continental Congress and the concept of Declaration. They can ask you a question on what does the American Revolution mean? What is the significance of it? Significance is first democracy in the world, true democracy. British were a democracy, but a constitutional monarchy. And the British were, now the Americans are the first. That is why they call the oldest democracy in the world. Second, they will also now spread this message of liberty, concept of representation, taxation across the world. And that is where the American Revolution gets connected to the French Revolution. There are two connections between American and French Revolution. The first connection is there's a direct connection of American and French Revolution via the what is called as American War of Independence, but there's an ideological connection also. What happens in 1789 in France had a very strong connection to what happened in 1776 in America. American Revolution created the context for French Revolution, and the ideological base for the American Revolution was of the French Revolution was now created by the American Revolution. American Revolution: democracy, freedom, liberty, representation. Are we clear about the concept of American Revolution? Yes, it's taken us 1 hour, 20 minutes. With the context of 20 minutes, it's taken us 1 hour, basically. Right? So, all on the same page with me? Yes, sir. Okay. Now, in French Revolution, there are two types of understanding. Did slaves also get independence? That will be a different struggle which will happen and is still happening in America. The abolition of slavery is linked to the concept of American Civil War. American Civil War, that is a separate tangent altogether, 1850, 1860, 65. That's a separate issue altogether. That is again optional understanding, nothing to do with GS level. Now, here again, we are discussing French Revolution. So, Napoleon is should be and always should be understood with the context of the unification of Germany, Italy. If this session makes sense to everyone, we will maybe contemplating another video on unification of Germany, Italy, where I will discuss Napoleonic era. Here, I am going to concentrate on the French Revolution, which is between 1789 to 1799. These 10 years is considered to be the most important in French history, which is called the French Revolution. Is it still happening in America? Yes, America, not that there is slaves are free, but African American prosecution and all is very, 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 very high. 90% of all incarcerated or arrested men in America are black only. That's a separate issue altogether. Now, now you must have heard about this concept, French Revolution, quite a lot. Meaning everybody talks about French Revolution. French Revolution changed everything. The most important revolution, the revolution, the best revolution, this and that. But in the story of French Revolution, or if you look at the history of the French Revolution, French Revolution is the most comical event which never achieved nothing. Meaning they will start at a certain point and they will become complete circle there. Complete circle. Just to give you that understanding, they will start in 1789. They will start in 1780 by saying that we will write a democratic constitution. They will write a constitution in 1791, which they will not implement. And that in turn will lead to another revolution, rather another constitution in 1793. Here they became a constitutional monarchy. Here they were a monarchy. They become a constitutional monarchy. They become a republic. Then Robespierre is going to totally derail the whole event. And that is going to lead to reign of terror. Then in 1795, they will write another constitution. That will again be in place for 4 years. Then a coup is going to be attempted. 1799, they will have Napoleon capturing power and the concept of consulate rule. Napoleon will then keep till 1802 the Americans, the French, a democracy. And in 1802, he is going to proclaim himself emperor. And by 1815, he will fight the Napoleonic Wars. And from Napoleonic Wars, they will come back full circle because in 1815 and 1816, you will have the Bourbon Restoration. They will start with Louis the 16th and they will end with Louis the 18th. And they will write one, two, three, four, five constitutions in the process of doing it. And what is very interesting is that this is not even the last constitution which they wrote. Between 1815 to 1850, not 48, they will be again a monarchy. In 1848, they will write their sixth constitution, which will be only there for 4 years because in 1852, Louis Napoleon or Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew is going to capture power. 1852, it will become again an emperorship. Till 1871, they will be under Napoleon III. And in 1871, they will write their seventh constitution, which then will take them till the First World, 1940. After that, they will again write another constitution, basically after the Second World War. So the French are good for nothing. They only know how to write constitutions, not implement it. This is basically the French Revolution. I've given you the French Revolution in 1 second itself. French Revolution is monarchy, constitutional monarchy, republic, directory, consulate, Napoleon, then back to monarchy, 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 then republic. Third republic, as they called when they were fighting the First World War. So we should thank our Constituent Assembly for writing one constitution, which in turn survived 75 years of democratic rule unlike the French who never were able to actually get a break. And what is interesting is from 1792 onwards till 1802, they were in war also, called the Revolutionary Wars. So, what comes in the examination is actually the causes of the French Revolution rather than the course of the French Revolution. Because the French Revolution is just a event one after another, constitution, 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 multiple constitutions one after the other. Now, why France went into a revolution? French Revolution causes long term, immediate. Now, long term, you have to understand political. When we talk about the political, you have the concept of absolutist monarchy. And the absolutist monarchy, the monarchs are called the Bourbons. Not the biscuit, but the original dynasty, Bourbon dynasty. And they were producing what are called the Louis. Louis the 15th and Louis the 16th is important to us. They are absolutist monarchy. All power is concentrated in the Louis, and they are in their own ivory towers, which is they don't know what is happening on the ground. They don't care about that also. They have never cared about it. And over and above that, these absolutist monarchies, they were so distracted and detached from the people that Louis the 16th's wife Marie Antoinette is going to say when bread riots are going to happen that if they cannot eat bread, let them eat cake. That she did not even know that cake is also made out of bread only. So absolutist monarchies create this aura where they are in very good comfort, luxury, along with their aristocracy, and they don't know what is happening on the ground. France is a very good example of that. They are the second largest population also at this point of time in in Europe, second largest population. And what is even more interesting here is that there used to be something called the Estate General, an institution which used to meet for deliberation, but since 1619 it had never met. So there is political corruption, there's political frustration, there is no political representation. But what makes this story more problematic is not the political, but the social. And the social is called the ancient regime, not ancient. This spelling which you see here is not the wrong spelling, it's a French spelling. Ancient regime. Now, what is the ancient regime? It is a concept which existed in France, under which there were three estates: first, second, and third. Three estate model means nothing but three stratas of society. Now, what is the concept of three estate model? The first estate is nothing but the nobility. No, the first is the clergy. Then it is the nobility. And then it is the common people. Clergy is 1% of the population, the church bureaucracy, and the first estate did not pay any taxes. Second estate is again 1% of the population. They together control 20% of the best land. And the nobility is nothing but the relatives of the king. They again pay zero to no taxation. 98% of the population, which would include peasants, workers, and a word which Chirag was using, the bourgeoisie. Bourgeoisie means the commercial classes. They are the ones who have all the burden of taxation and they pay all the taxes to the king also, to the church also, the tithe as it is paid. Now, the problem in this system is when they used to meet in the estate general, though they are only 1%, 1%, 98%, each estate had one vote, meaning total number of votes was three. So every time the first and the second estate used to come together and outvote the third estate, which in turn meant that there was no political representation, and there's social frustration. This social frustration is something which will become important for making France a boiling point, taking it to the boiling point and becoming a problematic, you can say, sector where anything and everything will lead to a explosion, which is called the French Revolution. 1%, 10% state within a state, little to no taxes. 2% to 1% of the population, 20% of the land paid no taxes. 98% of the population paid everything. They had no power, they had no economic power, they had no political power. And that is the frustration which is going to come through very soon. Now, if I add to it the administrative system which is corrupt, and when we talk about the economic, it is even more dangerous. There are droughts which are happening, but no investments in the land itself or in the uh, agriculture itself. There are famines which are happening, which in turn leads to what is called as bread riots. Further, there is no central bank. There is no central bank, and the Bourbons only take money from their own relatives at a very high rate, very high rate of taxes or of interest in that regard. Further, they had extravagant lifestyles, but unnecessary wars they fought. They fought the Austrian War succession with no avail. They fought the 7 Years' War with no avail. They also were the ones who were foolishly funding the American colonies for their independence. This is where the immediate cause is coming through. The connection between the American and the French Revolution is Americans were getting money from the French, and in the end they will also get nothing but the Statue of Liberty from them also. Wherein, please don't do that, Chirag. The idea is that the French were funding the American Revolution and American independence, and they will in the end get nothing but debt. And that is where economic causes were even more problematic. Now, if I add to this the ideologies which were prevailing at this point of time, the role of the Enlightenment is also very important. Why? Because by 1800, by 1700 rather, the people had started to change and their mentality had changed. It's again a connection between America and France, that the idea of Montesquieu, the idea that constitutional government is the best, separation of power should be there. The idea of Voltaire, where he said that the church should not have control over the state. The idea of Rousseau that man is born free and is everywhere in chains. The idea that we are creating an order which puts us under stress itself. All of these things create a certain explosive point. By 1780s, the economic condition is in tatters. There's a lot of problem. Politically, everybody is frustrated. Socially, there is too much discrimination. And administratively, there is a lot of corruption. Ideologically, the people have changed. In 1619, when the last estate general had met, and when it will meet again in 1789, the people had now started to think of liberty, freedom, and other concepts which previously was not known to them. And this is where the ideologies will matter and the long term factors will. And if I bring in the immediate causes here, which brings in the concept of corruption, inefficiency, absence of local self government, this is where all of these things are compounding together. The men and women are in a way fighting for bread. There is panic. There was also a rumor which was spreading that they want to kill everybody through starvation itself. And the idea is very simple. With all of this happening together, once the French are going to get to know something which they did not anticipate, because of them funding the American Revolutionary War, Necker, who was their finance minister, then tell Louis XVI that they were bankrupt from 220 million francs in positive. They were now 1110 million in deficit. And this is going to produce the French Revolution. The trigger is going to come from here. So before I talk about the events itself, the course, what are the causes? Causes: political frustration, political discrimination. Second, social frustration and social discrimination itself. Further, what we know is the idea that we also have administrative corruption. Then the estate general was unrepresentative. Last but not the least, the idea that the French Revolution or the French were funding the American Revolution, which in turn led to an economic crisis. Are we all on the same page? Can I move to now the course? Because the course cannot be asked in the examination, but the causes can. Do we understand the causes of the French Revolution? Yes? Okay. Now, let's talk about the course. I'll give you a brief understanding here, and that should be enough to write any answer. But the questions are never going to revolve around the concept of the French Revolution course. Now, what is the course of the French Revolution? Now, pay attention. When Necker is going to get to know that the French are bankrupting or are bankrupt, he will go to Louis XVI and say that we have lost money. As soon as he will go to Louis XVI is going to remove Necker. And he's going to appoint a person called Calon. Calon. Calon will come up with a solution, and his solution was, let's tax the first and second estate. And that proposal was brought in what is called as the Assembly of Notables. But in the Assembly of Notables, the first and second estate representatives stormed out in what is called as the aristocratic revolution or aristocratic revolt, where they said, we will not let France go down the drain, we will not give any money. When Louis XVI is going to get to know that Calot had suggested taxing the first and second estate, he will also be there. And thereafter will come a person called Brigney. Now, Brigney could not do what Necker did, could not do what Calot could. So, Brigney came up with a solution. Let's do one thing. Let's call the estate general again, and we'll call it now in 1789 May, and let the first and second estate outvote the third estate, and let's tax the third estate even more so that we can get money out of them to fund the debt or to revive ourselves from the debt itself. This is where Brigney forgot about one thing, that the last time the estate general had met, it was a very, very benign type of population. Now it is a revolutionary population with ideas of enlightenment in their head itself. And this is where, when the estate general will be planned to be called, the third estate members are going to meet the 16th. And they will say to Louis the 16th, see, we are 98% of the population and we get only one vote. Please give us one more vote so that we can balance it out in the estate general. Louis XVI said, okay, 800 representatives are there from the third estate. I'll make it 1100. However, when he was asked about giving one more vote to them, he said, I'll talk about this later. Something very important has come up. And he stormed out of that, you can say, assembly or in that conversation itself. This is where the third estate realized that Louis XVI is not going to give anything. And that is where now the third estate started to become more and more active, and they became more and more revolutionary. Now, on the day of the third estate, or rather on the day of the estate general, when people, the first and second estate, got to know that they are going to disrupt the estate general itself, the rooms or the gates of the main treaty of the main palace of Versailles were closed. The Versailles palace was closed to them. When the Versailles palace will be closed to them, they will then go to the tennis court, a indoor tennis court, and they'll take what is called as the tennis court oath. In the tennis court oath, the third estate will say, we establish ourselves or transform ourselves from the third estate to what is called as the National Assembly. And we will only come out of this tennis court when we will have written a constitution. And now the French Revolution had matured itself, and the first constitution making process has started. However, Louis XVI is going to get to know that the National Assembly is writing a constitution. He will bring in the army. When the army is going to come through, people will get very, very scared, and the people will see that they need to protect the National Assembly. And this is where the Bastille storming is going to happen, where people will best storm the Bastille, take out the different types of weapons out of it, so as to protect their National Assembly in that regard. That is called the Bastille Day celebrations, which happened today, which recently the Prime Minister was also part of. The Bastille Day, in turn, will lead to the National Assembly writing a constitution. Now, a very relevant and important question which I will ask you is, by now starting to write a constitution, will the economic crisis and the political crisis of the French automatically get sorted? What is the answer to that question? Come on. What is the answer to that question? Very simply, no. Writing a new constitution does not do anything. Nothing whatsoever. It only, you are now writing a constitution. And the problems which were being talked about previously are going to now again come into fore. And this is where the August decrees of the National Assembly will be produced on 4th August 1789, and will be declared as the Declaration of the Right of Man and Citizen on 26th of August 1789. The Declaration of Right of Man and Citizen only refers to man and citizen only active who pay taxes. That was problematic. But this is considered to be the mother of all constitutions, because all fundamental rights which you talk about today are enshrined, and this is the only important document which came out of the French Revolution. See, it said natural rights, the concept of equality, freedom, individual security, and property. It talked about the common will, everyone is equal before the law. Further, nobody can be arrested unlawfully without a judicial order. Freedom of speech, press is guaranteed. The security of public rights is the duty of the state. Further, sovereignty is vested in the state, in the people, not in the state itself. Thereafter, everybody has a right to acquire government ranks. Private property should not be breached. All to diffuse freedom of religion in that regard. Freedom lies in not harming others, which is called reasonable restrictions. And all officers are accountable to the public. If you actually look at it, most of our fundamental rights are a product of this whole process itself. And the Declaration of Right of Man and Citizen is going to be one of the most important documents which is going to come out of the French Revolution. But again, this is not going to do anything but lead to the Constitution of 1791. Under the Constitution of 1791, the National Assembly is going to transform itself to Legislative Assembly. And when it will establish itself as the Legislative Assembly, it is now going to become a unicameral constitutional monarchy. But if you are Louis the 16th, you will not like the fact that your power has been curtailed, in the concept that the king was now going to act in accordance to what the Legislative Assembly wanted. And this is where what is going to happen is, there will be a lot of activities which will happen together. Now, what are those activities? Let's talk about them. See, when they will become a constitutional monarchy, Louis the 16th will send a message to the Austrian and Prussian sector. And they will say to the Austrian and Prussian sector, the American French Revolution is happening in France. It will spread to you. Attack France. Give back my power once you have taken France. And this in turn will lead to the 1792 war, Revolutionary War, which in the Legislative Assembly, the moderates were ruling, which are called the Girondins or the Girondinists. This is where the concept of left and right also comes through. The Jacobians, who wanted the revolution to go further under Maximilian Robespierre, were sitting on the left, and the Girondinists, who were protectors of the constitutional monarchy, were sitting on the right. The idea was Jacobians wanted a republic, Girondinists wanted a constitutional monarchy. But this war was started by Louis XVI only, so as to destabilize France. But for 10 years, they will keep on fighting this war. Only Napoleon will stop this war. So now they have not implemented this constitution properly, and they're now fighting a war also. What will happen is, twice Louis XVI will try to flee to Austria. Once he will be caught by a guard, and when the connection between Louis XVI and the Austrian and the Prussian kings are going to come through, that will lead to what is called as the storming of the Tuileries. Sansculottes is a word which is used for the Jacobian lower rank, who are basically the petty bourgeoisie, the dock workers, the workers. They're called sansculottes. They did not have buttons in their robes. That is why they're called sansculottes. the ones who do not have culottes or buttons. So the idea was very simple. Once Louis XVI's connection with the Prussian and Austrian sector will be established, the storming of Tuileries is going to happen, and Louis XVI will be arrested. And when he will get arrested or by the people, now the Jacobians will capture power. Legislative Assembly is going to become the National Convention. And on 21st September 1792, France is going to be proclaimed as a republic. And on 21st January 1793, Louis XVI will be guillotined and killed, and they will kill a active, very important member of the Bourbon dynasty. So they have now written one constitution in 1791, and now they will start the second constitution writing, which is called the 1793 right constitution. But here in the French Revolution will get derailed. Why will it get derailed? Because rather than implementing the new constitution, Maximilian Robespierre is going to capture power, and once he's going to capture power, he will then introduce what is called as the Reign of Terror, under which two committees will be established: public safety, general safety. And now Maximilian Robespierre, the leader of the sans-culottes of the Jacobians, is going to start to purge all opposition. All royalists will be killed, all opposition will be killed. He will even kill one of his own members of the party. And this is where Maximilian Robespierre is going to turn out to be a dictator. And the French Revolution had now got derailed. This, his reign of terror, will go on between 1793 and 94. And when the people will realize that Maximilian Robespierre has lost his mind, there will be a reaction to it. And that is called the Thermidorian reaction. Thermidor was the month, is the new name which Maximilian Robespierre had given to July. And in this, the Girondinists will capture power. Maximilian Robespierre will be arrested and guillotined. So they killed their king. Maximilian Robespierre is also dead. Thereafter, they will write another constitution, and that is 1795 constitution, which is called directory rule. They will create a two-house bicameral legislature with five directors. They said if five people will be there, nobody is going to capture power. However, what happens is that they will be there for 2 years. They will realize Jacobians are coming back, and in 1793, 1797, they will try to, in a way, capture power. The directors will try to capture power. This is where Napoleon will come back from the what we call as Austrian sector and say what is happening. And in 1799, he is going to capture power in the process of a military coup, and then write another constitution which is called the 1799 Consulate Constitution, tricameral legislature with three different councils. And this is where French Revolution goes from 1 to 4 phases. First is National Assembly phase, then Legislative Assembly phase, National Convention phase, Directory phase. Now, before I go to the Industrial Revolution, what has happened? You need to know the causes. Causes, long term, ancient regime, political frustration, corruption, economic problem. Course, as I told you, is nothing but a comical journey of constitution after constitution. 1789, 1791, 1793, 1795, and 1799. Louis XVI, constitutional monarchy, republic, then reign of terror, then consulate rule, rather directory rule and the consulate rule. Thereafter, Napoleon captures power. He will become emperor. That is called Napoleonic era. That's a separate tangent altogether. So, very simply, what we've understood till this point is the concept of American and French Revolution. Does this make sense? Does this make sense? Everyone, come on, because I would like to give you a 10-minute break here because Industrial Revolution is very, very important. And that is where I want us to have a small break, make our thoughts in an ordered fashion. Two major revolutions, American Revolution, French Revolution is done. So let's let's take a small break here, 10 minutes. We'll come back at 10 o'clock. Break till 10 p.m. And between 10 to 10, 10 to 11, let's cover Industrial Revolution, thereby completing all your revolutions. I hope all of this is making sense. Please do come back at 10 p.m. It is 9:50 right now, right? I'll see you at 10. Okay, welcome back. Can we start again? Yes. Okay, Navya. Thank you for your confirmation. Now, what we've understood is American and French Revolution. Now, these two are political revolution, right? One is called the moment of economic nationalism, and the other one is called a moment of political nationalism. Meaning, the difference being the first one, they were rallying behind the concept of economic exploitation. The second one, they are rallying behind the concept of political ideas, democracy, liberty, fraternity in that regard. Now, the Industrial Revolution is a totally different cup of concept, a cup of tea in that regard, totally different concept. It's an economic revolution. Now, first things first, what do you mean by Industrial Revolution? Because growth of factories and growth of industries is not Industrial Revolution. This is the first mistake which a lot of people make, which is just because the secondary sector is rising does not mean that you're an industrial revolution or revolutionized nation. That means industrialization, not industrial revolution. Because what they do is that they use for the first parameter. The first parameter says that when the primary sector is outperformed by the secondary, then it is called only industrialization. Meaning between 2000 and 2010, if the primary secondary taking into consideration there's no tertiary at this point of time, 1700, 1800 in that regard, the idea is that if it was contributing 10% to the GDP and this at 5% at GDP contribution, this has now still remained 10%, that this is contributing 20% to the GDP. And that is where it is called industrialization. India went through industrialization, is still industrializing, but it never went through industrial revolution. So when do we say that there's an industrial revolution? When the second process happens with the first one. What is the second process? The second process, the second process is called as structural transformation. Meaning when the population which is involved in primary that moves to secondary, it is called structural transformation. Meaning in 2000, if the 1 lakh people were in the primary sector and in secondary sector there were 20,000 people, and in 2010 if there are 20,000 people here and 1 lakh here, this is where there's a structural transformation happening. The people are coming out of the primary and going into the secondary sector. When there is demographic change, when there is demographic change along with the concept of GDP performance, then we say that industrial revolution has happened. Then in India, industrial revolution never happened for a very simple reason, because India had what is called as, or India still goes through what is the concept of what is called as single male circular migration. Meaning only the male member migrates to the industrial sector, into the urban sector. He works for a certain period and thereafter goes back. So it is single main circular. Circular means sometimes in agriculture, sometime in industry, sometime here, sometime there. So therefore, there is no structural transformation that the men have moved out of rural to urban. Rural to urban migration in India is circular, and it is periodical, it is seasonal. That is why industrial revolution never happened in India. We are industrializing. We define industrial revolution when the GDP performance of the secondary sector is better than or more than the primary, and the population has moved out of the rural sector into the urban sector, or there is population migration from the rural or the primary to the secondary. Only when demographic performance meets GDP, then only we say it is industrial revolution. India is an industrialized nation, but India never went through industrial revolution. The structural transformation of the society is very important. That never happened. Now, why did industrial revolution happen in Europe? There are generic reasons for that. It happened in three phases: first in Britain, then in France, Germany, US, and then in Japan. And the generic reasons which are given are quite diverse, which is there was a population explosion in Europe that in turn led to better agricultural methodologies being used. Fact that there are new transportation methods which will come through. The idea that there was raw material available and colonialism was very, very important. And this is where the fuel sources were also available in Europe. However, these don't really tell us why did it happen in Britain first. So the most standard question which UPSC has asked previously, and why did it happen in Britain? Industrial revolution happened first in Britain in 1750s to 80s. Then the second phase will happen in France and Germany. Then it will happen in the only Asian nation, which is Japan. But the idea is, why Britain? What was so specific to Britain that it industrialized first than any other nation in Europe itself? These generic concepts can be talked about, but these are not specific to the concept of industrial revolution in Britain. That we have to understand. In order to understand that, we have to understand how Britain was between 1700 and 1750. See, during 1700, Britain had a stable population, and the resources available within a rural sector were more or less equal to the resource demand, meaning grain demand was stable, and therefore agriculture was good enough. And the two major occupations which were there at that point of time was agricultural labor or farmer. Either you can own your own land, or you can be working on someone else's land, which is a tenant. More than that, you could be a big landlord, but it's a equilibrium position where the grain demand is stable, the agriculture is stable, everything is fine. However, between 1700 to 1750, what happens is there's a population explosion, or at least in Britain, because of death rate going down, birth rate being more or less constant, there was a doubling of the population. And when population doubles, the grain demand doubles. Now, there are two ways to manage increased grain demand. The first way is to expand agriculture. But the problem which was there in 1750s was something called the enclosure movement. Enclosure movement was a systematic parliamentarian landlord based connivance based conspiracy in which, through enclosure acts which were passed by the parliament itself, free common land or free available resources were enclosed by the big landlords, which in turn means that agricultural expansion was not an option because land was a scarce resource. The other option which you have when there is a population explosion and food demand goes up, it is called agricultural revolution, that you increase the yield. The yield needs to increase. For that, you need new technology. Now, as we know, what is the concept of the the mother of all inventions is necessity, and therefore new concepts came through, which is called the Rotherham plow, a steel tipped plow or rather iron tipped plow, which could go into the heavier soil itself. There's something called the seed drill, which could at one point of time push four seeds together rather than two. And all of these things allowed for better technological development within agriculture. And what happens is agri productivity goes up. But with agri productivity, one more thing goes up, which is labor productivity. If agriculture productivity goes up and labor productivity goes up at the same point of time, labor productivity means that one man can now produce 10 kgs in place of 5. And this means labor demand will go down. And with labor demand going down and agricultural population increasing, what happens is there is no land because of enclosure movement, and there is no jobs because of better technology. This in turn produces what is called as a surplus unemployed population, something very, very important for structural transformation. At the same point of time, in urban Britain, what is going to happen is India will come into the context of Britain. India, Africa, colonies will come. Small factories had developed to supply to the increased population. But with colonial markets available, now there was a lot of demand which was. So at the same point of time, these factories now wanted to become industries. And if they wanted to become industries, they needed labor. And that labor came from the rural sector, that surplus unemployed population. So therein you can see two things are happening together, which ticks both boxes for industrial revolution. Enclosure movement and better agricultural productivity in turn led to surplus demand, surplus population, which in turn then migrated to the urban sector, and the secondary sector started to outperform the agricultural sector or the primary sector. And this is where you have to take into consideration the agricultural revolution which happened, the enclosure movement which happened, and the idea that they could now get more out of the same unit of labor. And with that, you also had geographical advantages, long coastline, navigable rivers, coal and iron, a stable political system, unlike France, a Anglican nation which was Protestant, colonial markets, which is the main driver of the demand itself, a banking system which was very well in placed, and first the push is going to come from domestic, then from international. What will also help, in the same period, there will also be a lot of inventions which will happen within the cotton sector. The flying shuttle, spinning jenny, this is the flying shuttle, spinning jenny, then what is called as the water frame, then you will have the spinning mule, then the power loom, which all will increase the power of the nation to produce more and more cotton textiles. That is why it happened in the cotton textiles first. Anglican means it's a Protestant nation, which means it is more cosmopolitan. So therefore, with the sewing machine and with the cotton gin, what is called as seed removing technology, Britain had to become the first industrial nation. So one of the first factors which led to the industrial revolution is doubling of population. Second factor is enclosure movement. Third factor is better agricultural productivity. Fourth factor is inventions. Fifth factor is colonial demand. Sixth factor is then movement of surplus labor out of rural to agriculture. So six factors together allow for the British to then use their geography better, their resources better, India better. So India was not the reason for the industrial revolution. India was now going to feed the industrial revolution rather than being the reason for the industrial revolution. There's a lot of misnomer, there's a lot of understanding which says that India funded the industrial revolution. No. The original purpose of India was to be fed by the industrial revolution. Later, it will create the capital which will in turn lead to further change. What you need to also further understand is that the first phase is going to be the cotton revolution. Cotton revolution meaning the textile revolution between 1780s, rather 1750s to 80s to 90s, in which, because there were no guilds in Britain, it was easier for people to shift to agriculture, from agriculture to textiles. Cotton was also coming from America at this point of time. Indian cotton was only used for supplying it to the rest of the world. France and Germany were not in any context. And this cotton revolution is going to create so much capital that it will allow them to go for their second phase, which is the heavy metals phase, metallurgical phase, where we will see the rise of the blast furnace, iron, steel, coal, and metal will become very, very important, thereby making the British the superpower between 1750 till 1945. Nobody will be even able to touch Britain properly because of its industrial might, which it developed because of its very favorable conditions. Enclosure movement is a movement which was started by the British parliamentarians along with the landlords, who basically started to enclose common lands, public lands, and therefore there was no available land for further agricultural expansion. This was a major difference between India and or China and Britain. Britain is an island nation and therefore it cannot expand beyond a point. India, as soon as population increased, agriculture increased into new lands. There was no need for agricultural technology to change. That is why we never innovated, they did. So the reason why the first phase is dominated by Britain, then closure, technology, and their will to change their understanding in that. The second phase is when the French and the Germans join this party along with the US. And the reason for that is very simple. They will start to realize that the might or the industrial power of the British is based on their industrial nation or industrial revolution. Now, the question is, why didn't France industrialize in the first phase? You know the answer already. Between 1780 to 1815 till 1840, France was in proper turmoil. French Revolution, Napoleon, Metternich system, then again Napoleon III. The idea is very simple. Political stability is very important. Second, there was no central bank in France itself. And thereafter, France had never bothered to industrialize itself because its nature of public interaction with the industries was also very limited. But France will realize that its, you can say, weakness to Britain is going to be because of the industrial power or industrial revolution. That is where the French will industrialize, but they will industrialize with three very interesting, unique features. One is called late comer advantage. What do you mean by late comer advantage? They did not need to go through the cotton phase. The reason is they already had smuggled all the technology of heavy industries, railways, and therefore a late come advantage means both Germany, both France, along with the US, they will not need to go through the cotton phase to go into industrial phase of metallurgy. Rather, they directly go into the metallurgical phase that is called late comer advantage. Second, the state sponsored a lot of things in France. Lot of things. Meaning they imposed tariff, they imposed quotas, they imposed prohibition of foreign imports. They created most of the infrastructure which was needed for the industrial revolution. They even created most of the transportation system. So French industrial revolution is generally considered to be more state sponsored than the British. And the latecomer advantage allowed them to go into metallurgical phase straightforward. Yes, they did not need to start from scratch. They directly went to metallurgical phase, the iron and steel. When we talk about Germany, the one of the biggest issues is till 1871 there is no Germany. Why? Because it was not unified. It was 39 to 40 different states under Zollverein of the Prussians. But till Bismarck is not going to unify Germany in 1871, Germany will never industrialize. However, once Bismarck will unify Germany and then it will become a very important industrial power. It will copy from the British but improve on it. And within 4 years of the Industrial Revolution, Germany is going to outperform the British, which is going to be one of the reasons for the First World War to happen. And again, Germans had some unique features. It was not that state sponsored, it was in between Britain and France. But the very intimate relationship between the banks and the industrialists will create a space in which German industrial revolution, their industrial output will become 5 times that of the British once they will again use their latecomer advantage to create an industrial power. They will also start to, in a way, specialized in one of the most important concepts, which is nothing but the automobile industries. Benz is going to be the first company to then create the automobile, and that is where the unique features of Britain, of France, and Germany can be asked in the examination directly as a question. Last is the US. The US has its own problem. Till there will be Napoleonic problem in Europe, they will have no access to technology. More than that, their north was more industrial and south was more slave based plantation. And till they will not be able to resolve their slavery issue, which is the American Civil War, they will not be able to industrialize in any way or form. This is basically outside your syllabus because American Civil War is actually not part of your syllabus. And therefore, what is going to happen is they will have a fragmented approach. North will become little bit of processing area, south will be cotton producer. But once the north south divide will be removed through the American Civil War, then they will start to create what is called as corporation based industrial revolution, which even till today the Americans follow. Single men, single companies controlling whole sectors. Rockefeller Oil, Vanderbilt Railways, Morgan, JP Morgan still today exists, which is finance, Carnegie for steel. Same. So all companies till today exist. And the reason for that is because these companies control that whole sector itself. This is a very interesting feature of American industrial revolution. The last to industrialize is in the third phase, the Japanese. And Japanese industrial revolution comes because of something called the Meiji Restoration. Now, what is the concept of Meiji Restoration? Very simple. Before the Meiji Restoration happened in 1868, what was there was called the shogunate system, in which emperor, his name is Meiji, was at the power helm. Under him were shoguns. Shoguns are nothing but military lords, and these lords used to control what are called as the samurais. And these samurais then control the common people. It's a pure feudal system, which is called the shogunate system. However, with colonialism spreading across the Asian sector, samurais and the emperor started to realize that Japan needs to industrialize, but the shoguns didn't. And that is where the samurais and the emperor came together to remove the shoguns, and that is called Meiji Restoration. Emperor Meiji being restored power is called Meiji Restoration. But the Japanese had one very big issue. They have no resources. They're just a mountain range in a sector where there are no resources whatsoever. And their whole industrial revolution was about importing everything. But what they did was they created multiple interesting concepts. They sponsored the technical education of their children to go to the West and learn. And they created what are called as zaibatsus, business conglomerates. Mitsubishi, Mitsui, Yasuda, Honda. Cities were created like a Jamshedpur model, wherein cities were created around industries so that only one business family controls everything. They also reverse engineered a lot of different concepts which they brought in from the West. And their spirit of work ethic and technical education also helped them in expanding and becoming what they were in the larger scheme of things. So, when we talk about the Industrial Revolution, American Revolution, cause is important, course cannot be asked. French Revolution, again, cause significance is important, course cannot be asked. Industrial Revolution, why Britain is one question. Now you know that. What are the unique features of Britain and France? France and rather Germany, you also know that. You also know what is the peculiarity with the US and peculiarity of the Japanese. And thereafter, you also know the general causes of the French Industrial Revolution in Britain. And in, are we on the same page? Because these three revolutions, at least one question has come in the past 10 years out of any of these. If this makes sense, then we'll be able to further develop just one last concept, which is the social impact of the industrial revolution. Are we on the same page here? Yes, sir. Okay. Now, let's talk about the social impact of the industrial revolution. See, if I talk about impact, it was an economic revolution. Despite running low on natural resources, industries, Japan, power, mind game. Yes, yes. When we talk, it was an economic revolution which changed the course of history itself. It is the reason why we have all this technology, all this infrastructure in place. But socially, the industrial revolution was the worst thing to happen to humanity. Why? Because the first it's a sector to get impacted by the industrial revolution was military. Wars became more and more bloodier because of the industrial revolution. Previously, only hundreds of people could be killed. Now, lakhs of people could be killed in one go. Thereafter, it led to the wars becoming more and more bloodier. That is why the First and the Second World War together killed close to 11 crore people. And what will happen is that the industrial order will be based on exploitation, which is called capitalistic form of exploitation. Labor exploitation is what the basis of industrial revolution is. Further, be it chemical warfare, be it the weapons of mass destruction, everything is based on that only. You have to also understand one more thing, which is that slums, disease, very low level of standard of living, all are part of the social impact of the industrial revolution. Uneven urbanization, all of that is social impact of industrial. Nuclearization of the family. which is joint families were broken in the rural sector. In the urban sector, four-member families were there, which in turn had the husband and wife both working. For women, it gave opportunity but also created burden because she was a mother and a worker at the same point of time. At the same time, she was a wife also. At the same point of time, child labor as a concept came through. Child labor and bonded labor, or what is called wage labor based exploitation, was something which became very common in the Industrial Revolution. And that is why, when everybody went into poverty, death, destruction, destitution, people like Marx became very, very important. Socialism became very, very important. But you need to also understand one more thing, that the most important thing which social impact of Industrial Revolution was time. Time, which is called the concept of time. This is a live session, Arzu, not a recorded video. That is why I can read your doubt. So, the concept of time was also commodified, meaning how we see time today is based on the concept of Industrial Revolution. Time was based on circadian cycles and geological time. The monetization and the commodification of time happened during the Industrial Revolution. Time is money, and the idea that food had to become fast food. Dietary patterns changed. Sugar became very important because you needed to take the calories very quickly. Further, time became a disciplining concept. Does not matter how good you work, it is how long you work. Industrial Revolution, the second most important machine which became common across the world and still is one of the most common device used, is the clock or the watch. All of these things were to commodify time, and also in a way see what is your output. Your output is not based on effort, but is based on time. So time as a commodity, because time is a man-made concept. There is nothing in and around you which tells you what is the time. The 24-hour concept is purely industrial concept. Previously, if you look at your grandparents, their basic day was based on how the sun goes up and down. But today we are bound by the time which the Industrial Revolution produced, and in a way, it disciplines us and creates a social order which is based on capitalistic exploitation. The Industrial Revolution is also the single-handed reason for the Socialistic Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, and further, it is also one of the reasons for the rise of Marx, the rise of Russian Revolution, in turn, First World War, Second World War. All death and destruction which you see till today is because of that only. It will, Tanav, it will come later down the year, maybe next 2 3 months. So, be it inequality, be it social order based understanding, be it social stratification, be it very low standard of living, people getting killed over 100 rupees, wage labor based exploitation, all form of poverty in the world, all form of death and destruction in the world. Socially, one of the worst things which could happen to the earth, and even environmentally which could happen to the earth, is the Industrial Revolution. Environmental pollution, water pollution, air pollution, the amount of damage we've done to the climate itself, all is part of the Industrial. At the cost of economic revolution, we have destroyed and, in a way, totally diluted how we used to live. And till today, the Industrial Revolution disciplines you, controls you, and in a way produces the social realities which you see today. Modern history is going to come, I think, next to next month. Enough. If you look at the foundation batch, uh, or the schedule itself. So on this note, we are done with the three revolutions which I promised to you. The first one was American Revolution, Stamp Act, the concept of 7 Years War, Boston Massacre, Tea Act, Boston Tea Party, First Continental Congress, along with intolerable acts. French Revolution, ancient regime, estate, 91, 93, 95, 99 constitutions, reign of terror, Maximilian Robespierre. Industrial Revolution, why Britain, the concept of what Britain did differently, enclosure movement, surplus population, agricultural revolution, and at the same point of time, social impact of Industrial Revolution and the specificities of France, Germany, and the concept of what is called as the Japanese, you can say, story of Indian Industrial Revolution. All revolutions in 2.5 hours. For anybody who's writing the examination, please use this as a certain, you can say, way of summarizing everything. Eastern question and all, not in this session. Pavan, because the courseware in Indian history was specifically based on prelims and mains oriented preparation, which is anywhere where we had both ancient medieval, early medieval, modern art and culture, and it would have become 1,000 pages. We, if you want, and if everybody, there is a certain demand for it, I'll write another book for post independence and world history. It would be a little bit more different because it's a descriptive understanding, meaning mains orientation, world history and post independence needs a different type of approach. You don't need to go into facts per se, but you need to go into stories and conceptual clarity. So this, that is one of the reasons why the course on Indian history does not have world history, but that is by design, that the 5 units which are critical for the examination are in one place in that regard. And maybe we'll figure out something for post independence and world history, another separate courseware part 2, if that works for you. But I hope that this session has been useful. You found it helpful in the larger scheme of things. What Pavan Chaudhary is actually referring to is my book, Courseware on Indian History by McGraw-Hill Publications. If you write it on Amazon or Flipkart, you'll find it. And this book has ancient, early medieval, medieval, modern, and art and culture, as called by multiple students. It is nothing but the Lakshmikant of history, or one book for everything. If you, it's both prelims and mains oriented, and everything is given in the most concise manner. It's like a Lakshmikant type understanding. All notes are made for you, just have to learn it. Previously, we had 6 to 7 books. In the end, if this session has been useful, do like, share this session, subscribe to our channel. I'll most probably be back next week with with the understanding of world wars, first world war, second world war, and cold war, right? So, Chirag, we already have 2 marathons in which I've covered ancient, medieval, and modern and art and culture. You can refer to that. You can join the Telegram channel which I showed you. It has all the links. But next week, I will be back. If you want a session, you have to tell me that in the comment section. Just write in the comment section, yes, sir, we want a session on the world wars. If you do that, we'll figure out something for next week. Not planned as of right now, but can be done at a given point. Thank you. Take care.